By the time the mail coach lurched through the northern gate, Eleanor Ross could no longer feel the tips of her fingers, only the wet sting where the skin had split along the needle calluses and opened again in the sleet. She had ridden outside since midnight, knees locked against a wooden rail, one hand clamped on the iron bracket, the other wrapped around the rope that secured the painting crate at her side. The men inside had paid for warmth and straw and a roof over their heads. She had paid with silence. Each turn of the wheel threw freezing spray up from the rutted road and drove it beneath her thin shawl, through wool gone shiny with age, into shoulders already cramped from 14 hours bent over mending work the day before. Her shoes leaked as soon as they left Hertford. By Barnet, water had found her stockings. By dawn, every step she had not yet taken in London already lived in her bones as an ache. The coachman did not look at her when he shouted for unloading. Porters moved to trunks first. Gentlemen descended first. A woman in plum silk gathered her skirts and stared at Eleanor as one might stare at a stain on paving stone. When Eleanor tried to stand, her right leg buckled from cold. She caught herself on the coach wheel, palm against mud and iron. A groom laughed under his breath. No one offered a hand. Mrs. Ross had given strict instruction before she sent her. The crate was to leave Eleanor's possession only when a buyer's mark was written in the ledger at the charitable auction hall, and if Eleanor returned after dark, the attic door would remain barred. The words had been spoken calmly over breakfast while Eleanor stood and watched the others eat kidneys and toast. "You may test me if you wish," Mrs. Ross had added, lifting marmalade to her mouth with a small silver spoon. Eleanor had not tested her. She lowered the crate herself. It was longer than her arm span and heavier than it looked, oak corners braced with brass, locked with a plate engraved in a crest she had not studied because she had been forbidden to linger near it. One porter came near enough to inspect the brasswork, then withdrew when he saw her patched sleeve and said, "Not ours," as if she were contagious. She set the crate on a handcart whose wheel listed left, paid the hire from the 2 coins Mrs. Ross had counted into her palm, and began to push toward Covent Garden while sleet turned to mean, thin rain that came sideways with the wind. London at that hour smelled of wet horse, coal smoke, and cabbage water thrown from upper windows. Cart wheels hissed over stones. Shop boys hauled shutters open. A fishmonger shouted prices into the grey. Eleanor moved through it all with her shoulders braced and her eyes lowered because pity looked too much like scrutiny, and scrutiny was always followed by a question she could not afford to answer. The shawl slipped. She pulled it up. The cart jolted. The crate shifted and drove the handle into the bruise high on her wrist where Mrs. Ross's grip had landed 2 nights earlier when she found Eleanor asleep over copied figures. Eleanor tightened her hand around the wood and kept walking. She had once crossed these same streets in a hired carriage with her father, with polished boots on her feet and a book open on her lap, because he had laughed at her for reading account tables as if they were ballads. Captain Ross had owned 3 ships and trusted tides more than bankers. He had taught her to calculate tonnage before she was 10, to read a bill of lading before she bled, to mark false entries by the shape of a clerk's hand. Then storms took 1 vessel, fever took 2 investors, and creditors came not as men but as letters, stacked and sealed and merciless. Her mother died in the 2nd winter, face burning, and then gone cold in 48 hours. Mrs. Ross arrived 6 months later as widow and saviour, then became mistress of the house by deed and habit before the morning crepe had been put away. Chairs disappeared first, then silver, then carpets rolled and sold room by room. Wages promised to servants became wages delayed, then vanished, Eleanor's allowance became clothing mending for household economy. Her room became the attic because a dependent requires less space. Rain ran from Eleanor's hair into her collar. She passed a bakery and nearly stopped at the smell, sharp yeast and butter, but she had no coin left for bread. Mrs. Ross paid her for needlework in numbers that changed whenever money was due. 2 shillings became 1 because thread had been wasted. 1 became none because Eleanor had dropped a cuff in hearth ash. Hunger had become a discipline. She knew how long she could go before her hands began to shake. She knew how to sew through that shaking so that no one could accuse her of clumsiness. She knew how to swallow water slowly to trick her stomach into patience. These were skills no father teaches his daughter. She possessed them all. At the edge of the market square, a wheel struck loose cobble, and the cart lurched hard. The crate slammed against the side rail. Eleanor flung her weight forward and saved it from tipping, breath tearing in her throat. A passing clerk steadied the cart for 1 moment, then looked directly at her face and then at her hem, at the old dress turned twice, at the cuff, at the rain-blackened shoes, and removed his hand as if rank might transfer by touch. "Mind your load," he said, irritation brisk and impersonal, and moved on. She murmured thanks to his back, because manners cost less than anger. The charitable auction hall stood off the piazza behind a colonnade streaked black with rain. Its side door remained locked until 9. It was barely past 7. Eleanor dragged the crate into the lee of a stone pillar and stood over it while the square brightened by degrees from iron grey to pale pewter. Her fingers throbbed. She blew on them, watched the breath vanish, then slid one hand into the pocket sewn inside her skirt and touched the folded paper she carried there always, even when she slept. The letter was brittle now at the edges. She had read it until the ink had begun to fade, where her thumb paused on one line each night. "If ever I fail to return, take Eleanor to Wickliffe. A man keeps his promises there." The wax seal on the fold had cracked years ago, but 1/2 of the impression remained. A stag's head, antlers wide, above a narrow shield. Water dripped from the crate in a steady pattern. Eleanor looked down without intent, then froze with her hand still inside her pocket. On the brass lock plate, under the rain, the same stag's head glimmered, worn by age but unmistakable. Antlers. Shield. The exact slant of the left tine where the wax on her letter had broken away. Her pulse gave one hard strike against her ribs. Mrs. Ross had never allowed her to examine household pieces before they were sold. She had called this crate old decorative refuse and told Eleanor not to ask from which room it came. Eleanor withdrew the letter and held it under her shawl to protect it from rain, then leaned close to the lock. The match was not resemblance, it was identity. She should have looked away. She should have waited, signed the ledger, turned over the crate, and gone back north before the lamps were lit, because the attic latch had no mercy, and because women in her position did not survive by curiosity. Yet the crest on her father's letter and the crest on the locked crate sat in the same morning, in the same cold, in her hands. The world she had been given by Mrs. Ross rested on one claim, repeated until even kind servants lowered their eyes. All debts unpaid, all prospects ruined, all protections gone. Eleanor had spent 3 winters copying freight accounts from memory after midnight, writing numbers by candle end on scraps hidden inside a hollow stair-post, preserving proof that most large obligations had been settled before her father died. Twice she had seen Mrs. Ross feed bundles of correspondence into the kitchen fire and smooth her sleeves after, rose perfume and smoke braided together in the air. Once she had tried to rescue a half-burned page with bare fingers, and had carried blisters for a week. She had learned then that truth was not self-defending. Truth required hands. Hers would do. A footman in livery opened the side door at last and barked for early consignments. Eleanor folded the letter and returned it to her pocket with care. She took the cart handles again. Her shoulders shook from fatigue. Rainwater ran down her spine. Behind her, 2 men under the colonnade watched as she pushed the crate over the threshold alone, their expressions not unkind but distant, as if they had already decided which class of woman could be helped and which must carry her own burden until she dropped it. Inside, the hall smelled of damp wool and polish. Empty chairs lined the walls. A clerk sat at a high desk, quill scratching, and did not raise his head. "Name," he said. "Eleanor Ross." "Relation to owner?" She felt the answer catch under her tongue like a fishbone. Daughter, heir, dependent, servant. None of the words would survive the room unchanged. "Courier," she said at last, and set the crate where he pointed, directly beneath a tall window where rain tapped the glass like impatient fingers. The clerk dipped his pen, scratched her name without looking up, then held out his palm for the dispatch chit Mrs. Ross had sealed. Eleanor passed it over. He broke the wafer, skimmed the lines, and his mouth thinned in the particular way of men who believed they had discovered both a nuisance and a superior moral position. "You will wait," he said. "No lot moves to floor without valuation mark, and no mark is given until Mr. Pritchard arrives." He nodded toward the far wall where servants and porters stood with their loads, damp coats steaming in the weak heat from 2 iron braziers. There were benches along the wall, but each already held parcels, hat boxes, and 1 lapdog wrapped in a wool blanket by a lady who had not touched rain at all. Eleanor remained standing. Water collected at her hem and made a dark ring on the polished boards. Each minute in that hall pressed against the rule laid on her before dawn: return by dark or sleep nowhere at all. Hunger gnawed and then went dull. Her hands warmed enough to hurt. As feeling returned, the skin at her fingertips throbbed in small, hard pulses, as if every seam she had ever sewn had left a tally beneath her nails. She watched porters carry in a walnut escritoire with 1 brass pull missing, then a pair of painted screens, then a crate of porcelain shepherdesses swaddled in straw. The routine was orderly. The humiliation was orderly too. Her family name sat in the ledger in a neat black line, and beside it the word "Courier" reduced blood and history to hired motion. A boy no older than 15 hauled a rolled carpet across the boards and stared at her shoes, then at her face, then away. That was how London looked at women worn thin, quickly, clinically, as though measuring what could still be extracted. When the clerk asked for the consignor's signature to match the chit, Eleanor gave him the practised hand Mrs. Ross demanded from her in public, sloped and ornamental, then watched him compare it to previous entries. The page above held another Ross signature, dated 6 weeks earlier, for a silver tea service once displayed in the blue drawing-room. 2 weeks before that, a set of ormolu candlesticks from the front hall. 3 days later, Captain Ross's octant in a velvet case. She had polished that octant for her father at 14, while he explained latitude with salt spilled on the table. The table was gone now. The room was bare. Yet here, in another building under another roof, the same extraction continued with stamps, receipts, and charitable language that made theft look civic. The ledger page blurred for 1 breath, then steadied. Eleanor folded her hands so the clerk would not see them tremble, and fixed her gaze on the rain-silvered window, because if she looked too long at the ink, she would see not numbers, but a sequence of erasures. First her mother's laugh leaving the staircase, then her father's boots no longer sounding in the passage, then the lock turned on every room that had once held her life. Fever had taken her mother in 2 nights, quick and bright and merciless. The physician came with his leather case and his certainty, bled her, dosed her, spoke in Latin at the bed-foot, and failed with elegant composure. Eleanor remembered the basin water turning pink from cloths wrung out by trembling hands, remembered her own hair unbound because no one had thought to braid it, remembered her father kneeling with his forehead against the quilt, as if prayer might be a lever that moved the world back into place. 6 months later, he married again. 6. Ross entered with rose water on her gloves, 2 daughters in mourning grey cut from expensive cloth, and a voice low enough to pass for gentleness until one listened to the words. She called Eleanor poor child at dinner and had her moved to the smaller chamber by week's end because her own girls required better light for piano practice. Captain Ross did not see the first cruelties. He sailed after the wedding to salvage 1 contract and did not return before autumn storms. The letter that announced his death came damp from sea spray, edges rough where another hand had opened and resealed it before it reached Eleanor. Mrs. Ross wept in the parlour where visitors could witness her grief. Eleanor found the household account chest unlocked that same evening, and 2 ledgers missing by morning. From then on, debt became the family's spoken religion. There was always a bill to be brandished, always a creditor to invoke, always another necessity that required selling what remained. Yet Eleanor had watched her father total accounts at midnight when she was still in short sleeves, had memorised the ship manifests, had copied the figures years later by candle end from memory into scraps hidden from search. He had settled far more than Mrs. Ross admitted. He had secured freight against loss on 2 voyages. He had paid down the Lambert note in full. He had written 1 letter naming Wickliffe as guardian if he failed to return. That letter lived in Eleanor's pocket, folded to softness, its cracked seal the only witness left that did not lie for convenience. Mrs. Ross called it sentimental nonsense when she discovered Eleanor reading it, and struck the page from her hand with the back of a hairbrush. "Men promise the moon when they are dying," she had said. "The living must account for coal." She kept the coal room key on a ribbon at her waist thereafter. By the first week of November, the house that had trained Eleanor's memory by room and moulding had become a sequence of absences she navigated by instinct alone. The dining chairs vanished first, then the pier mirrors, then the harpsichord her mother had played on wet evenings when creditors were still only letters and not men at the door. Mrs. Ross sold with brisk discretion and called it preservation. Her daughters called it inconvenience. Miss Clara wanted Eleanor's blue cloak because no one notices colour on her. Miss Juliana took the ivory comb with seed pearl inlay from Eleanor's dressing box and wore it to church, laughing when Eleanor asked for it back. "You do not dress your hair for anyone," she said. "Why should an object rot in a drawer?" They took by claim and by attrition. Gloves first, then books, then the miniature portrait of Eleanor's mother from the mantel in the morning room, replaced with a shepherdess figurine chipped at the sleeve. When Eleanor searched for the miniature and asked Mrs. Ross directly, she received a look of bored astonishment. "You imagine theft because you have no notion of value," Mrs. Ross said. "You contribute thread and self-pity. I contribute management." In company, the script hardened. Guests were led through the parlour and introduced to Clara and Juliana by accomplishments, to Mrs. Ross by sacrifice, and to Eleanor last, as if she had wandered in from the lane. "My late husband's dependent," Mrs. Ross would say, smiling into a fan. "Plain, but very useful with hands." Then she would ask Eleanor to pour tea, while discussing marriage portions over Eleanor's shoulder, as though she were furniture with breathing capacity. Once, when a vicar's wife praised a hem Eleanor had stitched, Clara answered before Eleanor could speak. "She does all visible mending now. It suits her station." Laughter followed, small, polite, devastating for precisely that reason. Wages were promised for the work and withheld at month's end for invented faults. Bread was allotted by mood. Door latches became instruments of lesson and control. On nights when Mrs. Ross found fault with stitch length or timing, Eleanor slept against the attic door from the inside because the key had been turned before she could fetch water. She learned the house by sound rather than privilege. The silk rustle warning of Mrs. Ross in the corridor, the quick hard tread of Clara, the dragging slipper step of Juliana after midnight suppers, the old housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, pausing at the attic stair to leave a heel of loaf wrapped in cloth without knocking. Deprivation accumulated with bureaucratic precision. Shame did not burn hot after the first year. It settled cold, dense, and functional, like ballast. Now, in the auction hall, that ballast sat behind Eleanor's ribs as men crossed the floor with inventories and valuation chalk, as ladies in dry velvet inspected lots they called tragic bargains, as the clerk finally sanded the wet ink and slid the ledger aside with 2 fingers, dismissing her from his attention while keeping her body in his way. She moved her crate 2 inches to clear a passage and felt the brass corner bite her palm. The crest on the lock flashed again when the cloud light shifted. Stag, antlers, shield. The same mark pressed long ago into her father's wax. The same mark Mrs. Ross had treated as decoration. The same mark now entering circulation under charitable pretence. Eleanor set her thumb over it until the metal chilled her skin. She could not open the lock. She had no key. She had no legal standing anyone in this room would honour if she claimed it. She had a memory for figures, a letter with a surviving line, and a body near collapse from obedience. Yet obedience had not kept her fed, sheltered, or believed. Obedience had carried her through sleet to deliver her own history into strangers' hands. Across the hall, a porter lifted another lot onto trestles, a narrow sea chest banded in tarnished brass, initials nearly rubbed away. C.R. The sight struck low and hard. Her father's travelling chest had stood for years at the foot of his bed. She had hidden in it once at 8 to avoid French verbs, and been discovered by his laughter when she sneezed in camphor dust. Mrs. Ross had told her it had warped and been discarded. Here it stood under public light, with a lot tag tied to the handle. Eleanor stepped toward it and stopped when the clerk snapped, "Do not touch the property." Property. The word cut cleanly. She drew back, lifted her chin, and answered in the same formal tone that had kept her alive in drawing rooms where kindness was performance. "It was my father's." The clerk glanced at her patched cuff, then at the tag, then shrugged. "Then your father's creditors have excellent taste." He turned away to greet a gentleman at the door, and Eleanor remained where she was, damp and upright, one hand on the crate bearing a crest she was never meant to recognise, while the hall filled around her with witnesses who saw only a plain dependent waiting for instructions. She remained where she was, damp and upright, one hand on the crate bearing a crest she was never meant to recognise, while the hall filled around her with witnesses who saw only a plain dependent waiting for instructions. Then rose water cut through the smell of wet wool and coal ash, sharp as a blade through cloth, and Eleanor turned before she wished to turn because her body had learned that scent before her mind could deny it. Mrs. Ross crossed the threshold in dark green silk, trimmed with jet, dry from bonnet to hem. Despite the rain, Clara and Juliana gliding at her heels, in matching pelisses like pale reflections of one cruelty. The clerk, who had scarcely lifted his head for Eleanor, stood at once. 2 porters made room without being asked. Mrs. Ross did not look at Eleanor first. She surveyed the lots, the crowd, the ledger desk, measuring audience and advantage, then fixed her gaze with practised astonishment on Eleanor, as if she had discovered an inconvenience where she expected efficiency. "Why are you still here?" she asked, voice pitched to Carrie. Conversation stuttered and thinned around them. "Did I not make myself plain?" Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, and Mrs. Ross did not permit it. She stepped close enough for Eleanor to see rain pearls on the silk cuff, lifted one gloved hand, and struck her across the cheek with the back of the glove in one quick, economical motion that made more sound than force, and yet burned as if a coal had brushed skin. "Do not stand staring. Surrender the crate." Clara gave a small laugh that did not reach her eyes. Juliana watched the ring of listeners widen and lowered her lashes in an imitation of embarrassment. Mrs. Ross extended her hand toward the lock plate. "This lot is to be transferred at once to Mr. Bellamy's broker. We settle the Lambert remainder today. You have lingered long enough to damage us." Eleanor tasted iron where her teeth caught her lip. The Lambert note, paid years ago in her copied figures, paid in Captain Ross's own hand. She heard her father's voice naming sums at the dining table, and saw Mrs. Ross feeding letters into fire, and something in her chest drew tight, then hard. "There is no Lambert remainder," she said, low but clear. "My father settled it." The silence snapped. Mrs. Ross's face did not alter, but her pupils narrowed. "You will not speak of matters beyond your understanding in public," she said. "You will release that crate now." She took Eleanor by the wrist where old bruises lay yellow beneath skin, and squeezed until pain flashed white up Eleanor's arm. The clerk stared at his ledger. A lady near the brazier adjusted her glove and watched over the top of her fan. No one moved. Eleanor held the cart rail with her free hand and did not bend. "It bears a private crest," she said. "I request valuation in my presence." Mrs. Ross's laugh came soft and poisonous. "Request? You request?" She turned half toward the listeners, performing patience. "Do you hear this? She requests. A dependent who eats by my tolerance requests terms." Clara stepped nearer, voice bright. "Do not make a scene, Eleanor. You always grow dramatic when hungry." Juliana added, "She has been overtired for months. Forgive her." Forgive her, as if dignity were an offence needing pardon. Mrs. Ross released Eleanor's wrist only to shove the crate toward the nearest porter. "Take it," she said. "Immediate transfer." The porter gripped one end. Another reached for the other corner. Eleanor moved without calculation and caught the side brace. "Stop," she said. One word, not loud. It halted no one. The first porter pulled. The cartwheel, still listing left, hit a seam in the floorboards. The crate lurched sideways. Brass shrieked on stone. A corner struck the leg of a trestle table, bounced and fell. The lock plate tore free. Oak split along a dry seam with a cracking report that rang against the high ceiling and turned every head in the hall. The lid sprang open 3 inches, then farther, and the packed straw within slid out in a yellow spill. Canvas flashed, gilt edge. A frame wrapped in old linen rolled and struck the boards face up. For one suspended beat, no one breathed. Then Clara hissed. Juliana took 1 step back. Mrs. Ross went very still, the stillness of a woman who had just seen a plan tear in public. Eleanor dropped to her knees on wet skirts and pulled the linen away. A portrait stared up at her from varnish gone amber with age. A little girl of 2 or 3 sat against a dark background, hair black as ink, eyes too large for her narrow face. One hand curled around a carved wooden horse. She wore a white frock with blue ribbon at the sleeve. There was a small crescent mark just below the left ear, half hidden by hair. Eleanor's fingers rose to that same place on her own neck before she knew she had moved. The hall blurred at the edges. She had no memory of sitting for such a painting, only fragments, turpentine, a man asking her to hold still, her father laughing when she wriggled free. Yet the eyes were hers. The mouth, solemn and stubborn, was hers before years of silence had taught restraint. Around her whispers spread in tight currents. "Who is that child?" "Ross Lott, was it not?" "Why hide a portrait under lock?" Mrs. Ross recovered first. She stepped forward and snatched for the frame. Eleanor caught the lower edge and held. "It is damaged refuse," Mrs. Ross said through her teeth, voice now too thin. "Release it." Eleanor looked up from the painted child to the woman above her. "You called it refuse," she said. "You said it came from no room of ours." Mrs. Ross's expression sharpened into open contempt. "Ours! You claim ours now?" She leaned down, rose perfume heavy, and spoke so only Eleanor could hear. "Put that down, or I will have you thrown into the street before noon." Eleanor did not release the frame. Her knees shook from cold and strain. Her cheeks still stung where the glove had landed. She heard the rain against the tall windows and the scrape of boots repositioning as onlookers sought a better view. At the far door, a footman called for space in a voice suddenly strained, and a reply came from the vestibule, clipped and immediate. "Clear the floor." By 10:30, the auction hall had gone from murmuring commerce to breath-held theatre, and even the rain seemed to pause against the glass. Boots struck stone in measured steps. A cane tapped once, not for support, for warning. Men in livery entered first and took stations without fuss, black coats damp at the shoulder. Behind them came a tall man in a charcoal greatcoat, dark hair wet at the temples, jaw set as if carved from winter rock. He removed his gloves as he walked, handed them to a valet without looking, and crossed the boards with the economy of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging around him. Everyone knew him before the clerk whispered the title under his breath. Adrian Vale, Duke of Wickliffe. Eleanor knew the name from one surviving line on brittle paper carried against her heart for years. A man keeps his promises there. She had imagined age softening him, imagined perhaps a benevolent face from sentimental tales Mrs. Davies once read in winter. The man before her had no softness visible. His eyes, storm grey and unanswering, moved once across the broken crate, once across the spilled straw, then stopped on the portrait in Eleanor's hands. He halted so abruptly the cane tip clicked against the floor and held there. The hall waited. He did not speak for several breaths. His gaze remained fixed on the child's face, then dropped to Eleanor's face, then to the crescent mark at her neck, where damp hair had shifted aside. Something tightened at the corner of his mouth. Not grief exactly, not disbelief alone. Recognition struck too fast and too hard to hide. Mrs. Ross found her voice before anyone else could claim the silence. "Your Grace," she said, dipping into a curtsy perfectly calibrated for public sympathy. "Forgive this disorder. A servant girl has become hysterical over a damaged lot. We shall remove her at once." Eleanor rose unsteadily with the frame against her chest. Her wet skirt dragged. Her wrist throbbed where fingers had bruised it. She would have been dismissed in 2 breaths if she remained kneeling. She forced herself upright. The Duke did not look at Mrs. Ross. He looked at Eleanor's hands on the frame, then at the mottled marks crossing her wrist and forearm, then at the red line brightening on her cheek. When he spoke, his voice carried cleanly to the gallery without being raised. "Who gave you this?" Eleanor felt every eye in the hall swing toward her. She heard the clerk's pen fall and roll. She understood in the same instant that one answer could restore a life or end it in another form, because powerful men were not safer than cruel women, only stronger in the consequences of displeasing them. He took one step closer. Rain-dark wool, starch at the collar, a scar near his right thumb where he held the cane. He did not soften the second command. "Answer plainly. Now." Mrs. Ross moved at last to intercept. "Your Grace, she is not fit to address—" "Silence!" The word landed without force and ended hers entirely. Eleanor drew breath that hurt halfway down. "My father entrusted me to your Grace," she said. The formal cadence steadied her voice. "Mrs. Ross informed the world I had died." The crowd made a sound like wind finding a crack. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Juliana whispered, "Lies!" too quickly. Mrs. Ross stepped forward, colour rising beneath powder. "Outrageous!" she said. "She invents stories from grief and hunger. Captain Ross's child died in infancy. We buried her. There are parish records. Ask anyone in Hertford. This girl is a dependent taken in from charity. She has always been unstable." Eleanor felt heat surge through her body in a wave of fury so clean it almost calmed her. Stable, unstable, useful hands, dependent. The same words arranged for new audiences. The Duke's gaze did not leave Eleanor. "Your name," he said. "Speak it." "Eleanor Ross." "Age?" 22. "Proof?" She lifted her chin toward the broken crate. "The portrait, the mark at my neck, my father's letter." Her fingers fumbled once in her pocket, then found the folded paper and held it out. The wax fragment, cracked but legible, caught the light. Stag, antlers, shield. The Duke took the letter with precise care, as if the paper might fail if bent, and looked from seal to lock plate torn from the crate, then back again. His jaw hardened. "Who sealed this?" he asked. "My father, before his last voyage. Who kept it from me?" Eleanor did not glance at Mrs. Ross. She did not need to. The household letters passed through one hand after his death. At that, Mrs. Ross broke rank and reached for the paper. "Your Grace, that is private nonsense. She steals documents and forges—" He shifted 1 inch, and she stopped as if she had struck an unseen wall. He turned then, finally, and looked full at her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop with the motion alone. "You will stand where you are, Mrs. Ross," he said. "You will speak when asked." He angled his head toward the clerk without taking his eyes from her. "Send for the hall guard." The clerk bolted toward the side door. Mrs. Ross recovered enough to press her hand to her breast in injured dignity. "This is an insult beyond measure. I have managed Captain Ross's debts for 20 years under impossible strain. This girl repays charity with slander." The Duke's expression did not change. "You struck her in public," he said. "I saw it," Clara whispered fiercely. "She provoked Mamma." Juliana added, "Any guardian would correct such insolence." Eleanor tasted the old fear then, metallic and familiar, the fear of being outnumbered by polished liars in a room that preferred harmony over truth. She forced herself not to step back. The Duke looked again at her wrists. "Who did that?" No one in the hall moved. No one coughed. The question sat between them, bare and indecent in its directness. Eleanor had hidden bruises for years beneath cuffs and composure because speaking of them never altered the hand that made them. Now he had named what everyone else pretended not to see. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. She swallowed and answered without ornament. "Household discipline," Mrs. Ross called it. A muscle jumped once along his jaw. He handed the letter to his valet. "Seal that!" "No one touches it." Then to Eleanor, "Bring the portrait. Command, not request." Yet his body had shifted half a pace toward her, placing himself between her and the 3 Ross women with unconscious finality. She obeyed because resistance now would waste the only opening truth had given her. As she stepped forward, her knees threatened and steadied. He noticed. His gaze flicked to the bench near the brazier and back. "Stand," he said quietly, meaning hold fast. She did. Hall guards arrived breathless, truncheons at their belts, uncertain whom to challenge until they saw the Duke and halted. He gave instructions in clipped sequence. "No lot leaves this building. Lock the loading doors. Hold Mrs. Ross and her daughters for questioning. Record every witness present." Mrs. Ross lifted her chin in aristocratic outrage. "You have no authority to detain me over a servant's fantasy." He answered without raising his voice. "I have authority enough." He nodded once toward the broken crate. "And I have a name you buried." Eleanor felt the room tilt, not from faintness this time, but from the violent rearrangement of rank occurring in full view of those who had watched her struck and done nothing. The Duke turned back to her, eyes unreadable now, and gave the next order like a verdict. "You will come with me." The command reached her like a hand at the back of her neck, steadying and constricting at once. Eleanor shifted the portrait against her chest and took one step toward him. Guards closed around Mrs. Ross and her daughters in a stiff half-circle that looked almost polite until Clara tried to slip past and met a truncheon laid flat across her path. Juliana began to cry in small, outraged breaths. Mrs. Ross did not cry. She stood with her spine rigid, gloves buttoned, face arranged into the calm of a woman who had always mistaken control for innocence. "This spectacle will be regretted, Your Grace," she said. "I shall appeal to the magistrate before noon." "You shall speak to the magistrate before noon," he answered. "That much is certain." He turned to the auction clerk. "Bring sealing wax. 2 witnesses. Inventory this crate in full view." His gaze cut to the valet holding Captain Ross's letter. "The document remains in your pocket until I take it from you." Then, to Eleanor, quieter, "Keep the frame level." She obeyed. Her arms were shaking from strain, but she kept the painted child upright while the clerk and a second scribe approached with anxious care. Linen was wrapped again around the gilt edge. Wax was melted. A strip of paper was laid across the corner and stamped with the hall seal under 2 witness signatures. The broken lock plate was collected from the floor and placed in a canvas evidence satchel. The motions were procedural, almost dull. The effect was not. For the first time in years, what had been taken from her was not vanishing into a private room. It was being recorded. By the time the quarter bell sounded from St. Paul's through wet air and stone, the hall had shifted from scandal to process. A porter ran in from the rear corridor, cap in hand, rein at his collar. "Sir, the buyer's drays are blocked in the lane. 1 horse has gone lame." "No lot leaves," the Duke said. "Hold them." Another voice cut across the floor, thin with panic. "Tom has gone down. Someone fetch Mr. Ellis. Now." The words came from the loading doors near the yard, where damp straw had been tracked in thick bands over the boards. Several men turned and then turned back at once when they saw the guards around Mrs. Ross. Hierarchy chose its crisis. The woman in silk mattered. The stable boy could wait. Eleanor felt her stomach drop before she had seen him. She knew that tone. She had heard it at docks, at inns, at the edge of roads where men who hauled weight for wages were expected to stand until they failed, and then be replaced. A groom shouted again, "He cannot breathe!" One of the hall guards moved 2 paces and stopped, uncertain whether to abandon his post. The clerk hovered with wax, still warm, on his fingers. The Duke was speaking to his steward in low-clipped phrases Eleanor could not fully catch. The The room had narrowed to instructions and rank. The boy's breath was not in that order. She shifted the wrapped portrait to the nearest trestle and set it flat with both hands, careful even in haste. "Do not move this," she said to the scribe, and did not wait for assent. She crossed the floor at once. "Miss Ross," the Duke called, sharp as a snapped thread. She kept moving. The yard door stood open to rain. A knot of men in leather aprons had formed around a figure on the stones, and none of them had knelt. Eleanor pushed through shoulders and wet wool and dropped beside the boy. He was perhaps 13, maybe 14, all elbows and narrow wrists under a coat too large for him. His cap lay in a puddle. His face had gone a frightening grey beneath freckles. His chest hitched in shallow jerks. Each breath whistled high and wrong. One hand clawed weakly at his throat. "What happened?" she asked. "Fell from the dray step," a groom said. "Then started this. He does it in winter sometimes. Never this bad." "Did he strike his head?" The groom hesitated. "I do not know. He was up, then down." Eleanor touched the boy's temple, then the base of his skull, quick and firm. No wetness, no visible break. His pulse at the neck fluttered too fast. She remembered her father's medical journals spread open on a chart table during storm delays, his blunt voice naming signs while she recited them back to prove she had listened. Air first, then bleeding, then bones, always in that order. Panic kills as surely as injury if no one takes charge. She slid one arm beneath the boy's shoulders and lifted him slightly. "Thomas, can you hear me?" She did not know his name, so she gave him one she had heard shouted. His eyelids fluttered. "Good." "Look at me. Do not fight your breath," he gasped. "Cannot." "You can. Small pulls. Through your nose, if possible. If not, through your teeth. With me now." She pulled his scarf loose, then his neckcloth, fingers working fast despite the split skin at her knuckles. "You," she said to the nearest man, "take off your coat and fold it, behind his back." The man obeyed before he thought to object. She angled the boy forward into the support so his chest could expand. "Not flat," she said when another reached to lay him down. "He needs space." A runner appeared at her shoulder. "Mr. Ellis is coming." "Send for hot water and clean cloths," Eleanor said, "and a spoon of treacle if the kitchen has it. Hurry!" The runner stared a fraction too long, seeing only a drenched woman in worn cuffs, giving orders like a ship's surgeon. Then he ran. Rain blew under the doorway in thin, cold sheets. Eleanor shielded the boy's face with her body and counted his breaths under her own breath, the way she had counted stitch lengths in darkness. 1, 2, hold. 1, 2, hold. She laid her palm between his shoulder blades and rubbed in slow circles to steady him, not to cure, only to anchor. His chest still seized, then released by degrees. "Do not crowd him," she said without looking up. "Give him air." Boots scraped backward. The groom, who had spoken first, hovered at her left. "He stole no whiskey, miss. If anyone says so, he did not. He just skips meals to send coin home." "I did not ask about whiskey. They blame him when he goes weak." The old rage moved through her, clean and familiar. The world always preferred vice to vulnerability. A boy could be called lazy, and no one needed to alter the system that starved him. When the hot water came, she warmed her hands over the steam and pressed the heat through cloth against the boy's fingers and wrists. He flinched, then sighed, then coughed hard enough to bend forward. The sound was ugly and hopeful. Air moved deeper. Colour returned in faint blotches at his cheeks. "That is better," she said. "Again." He dragged another breath. Not smooth, not easy, real. Mr. Ellis, the auction surgeon, pushed through at last with his bag and impatience. He stopped when he saw her position and the boy's posture. "Who has been meddling?" "She has," the groom said, almost defiant, "and he is breathing." Mr. Ellis knelt, checked pupils, throat, pulse, chest. His brows rose despite himself. "Keep him propped," he muttered. "Good." He looked at Eleanor then with fresh attention. "Where did you learn this?" "My father read medicine when Weather held his ships at dock." "That is not training." "It was sufficient for this minute." He gave a short sound that might have been agreement. "He needs warmth and broth. No lifting today." He opened a small bottle and measured drops into water. "Slowly, boy. Sip." Eleanor stayed until the boy swallowed without choking and his hands unclenched. Only then did she become aware of silence behind her, the kind of silence that meant power had entered the edge of a scene, and everyone else had arranged themselves around it. She looked up and saw no one directly in front. The doorway to the inner stair, however, stood open, and on the gallery above, partly screened by the carved balustrade, a tall, dark figure remained motionless. Adrian Vale watched from the shadow between two pillars, one gloved hand resting on the rail. Rain light cut his face in angles, left his eyes unreadable. He had sent no one to pull her away. He had not announced himself. He had simply remained there while she worked, as still as carved stone. A pulse of awareness moved through her that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with being seen without preparation. Her wet sleeve clung to her arm. Her hair had fallen loose at the nape. Her hands were red and shaking around a stable boy's shoulders. She should have felt shame. She felt only the odd steadiness that comes when necessity strips pretense from everyone in sight. Mr. Ellis followed her glance, saw the Duke above, and rose at once. "Your Grace, the boy will live." The Duke descended the stair in measured steps. He stopped beside Eleanor and looked first at Thomas, then at the cloth in her hand darkened with rain and soot, then at the split skin along her fingers where new blood had reopened. He spoke to the surgeon. "Can the boy be moved?" "With support, to the servants' room by the back kitchen." "Do it!" Two grooms eased Thomas up. The boy caught at Eleanor's sleeve as they lifted him. "Miss," she leaned close, "breathe slow, sip what he gives you, you will be right." He nodded once, exhausted, and let go. When they had gone, the Duke turned to her fully. The yard smelled of wet leather, horse breath, and coal smoke blown low. Voices in the hall resumed at a cautious distance. Mrs. Ross was shouting again somewhere behind guards, but the words broke against stone and lost shape. "I told you to come with me," he said. "I heard." "And you chose to disobey." "Yes." No apology came. She had none to offer. His gaze held hers for a long beat, then dropped again to her hands. He took her right wrist with careful pressure, turning it so the light showed the bruises under the skin and the raw splits at each fingertip. "You reopened these." "They were not closed." "Do not be clever." "Then do not ask questions with answers you dislike." A faint movement touched his mouth. Not quite a smile. Gone at once. He released her wrist and addressed the nearest guard. "Fetch clean bandaged linen from the surgeon and a wool blanket. For Miss Ross." The guard moved immediately. Mrs. Ross's voice, carried from inside, sharpened by fury. "You coddle a hysteric while a lady stands, detained like a criminal." The Duke didn't turn. "You stand detained because evidence directs it." He looked back at Eleanor. Rain had beaded on his lashes and melted into the scar near his thumb. Up close, the cold authority she had felt across the room resolved into something more exacting and more dangerous, a tension without mercy. He missed nothing. "You knew what to do," he said. "My father believed daughters should learn what keeps men alive when pride fails." "Your father was uncommon." "Yes." He accepted that with a single incline of his head, as if she had passed some private measure. The guard returned with linen and blanket. The Duke took both himself. He shook out the blanket and set it over Eleanor's shoulders before she could refuse, the gesture brisk and almost impersonal, like covering a piece of valuable equipment before rain ruined it. Yet his hand paused one fraction at the back of her neck, where wet hair met skin, checking perhaps for fever, perhaps for tremor. Her body responded despite exhaustion. Skin prickled, breath shortened. She fixed her gaze on the yardstones until the sensation passed. He wrapped a strip of linen once around her right palm and tied it with soldierly precision, not gentle, not rough, simply competent. Then he bound the left the same way. His fingers were warm through the damp chill. She stood still because movement would have made the moment less bearable, not more. When he finished, he stepped back at once. "Now," he said, "you will come with me?" This time she nodded. He led her through the side passage rather than the central floor. As they passed the trestle, he checked the seals on the portrait and broken lock plate himself and directed his valet to carry both. Captain Ross's letter remained secured inside the valet's coat. The evidence moved with them, accounted for in sequence. No item was left to accident. At the vestibule doors, a clerk hurried forward with a sheaf of witness names, ink still wet. The Duke signed the detention order for Mrs. Ross and her daughters, then handed the paper back without breaking stride. Outside, his carriage waited under a slate sky, horses stamping, harness bells muted by rain. 2 mounted men took position at the rear wheels. Eleanor paused with one gloved hand on the carriage rail. Her knees felt hollow. The day had moved too quickly for belief to keep pace. She had left Hertford as a courier in a leaking shoe and entered London as a burden no one would claim. She stood now wrapped in a ducal blanket with bandaged hands, while guards held the woman who had ruled her life for 20 years. "Miss Ross," his voice came from just behind her shoulder, "inside!" She climbed in. He followed, taking the opposite seat at first. Cane laid beside him, posture straight despite the cramped space. The door shut. Rain struck the roof in hard, rapid taps. Through the fogged glass she saw the auction hall recede, its columns grey and severe, as if nothing within had shifted at all. Then the carriage lurched forward toward Wickliffe House, and across from her the Duke looked once more at her bandaged hands, at the bruise on her cheek, at the blanket clutched tight under her chin, and said in a voice too low for anyone outside to hear, "You will not return to that attic again. You will not return to that attic again." The words settled into the carriage like a legal seal cooling in wax. Eleanor kept both hands inside the blanket, fingers throbbing under fresh linen, and watched the rain stripe the glass until the street beyond became only motion and grey light. She should have answered. She did not trust her voice yet. Hunger had hollowed her. Shock had sharpened her. The two together made speech dangerous. The Duke waited. He did not repeat himself. The carriage rocked over uneven stones, then found smoother road. Hooves struck in disciplined rhythm. Somewhere ahead a driver shouted and was swallowed by weather. At last Eleanor said, "Your Grace has no claim over where I sleep." His gaze remained on her face. "No! You asked my name in a public hall. I gave it. That does not make me a ward by command." A muscle tightened once at his temple. "It makes you a woman threatened by fraud, assault and coercion whose principal abuser has just been detained. You are cold, exhausted and injured. I will not send you back to a locked room under a sloped roof." She held his stare even as the carriage lurched again. "I have survived there!" "Survival is not a standard I accept for what was entrusted to me." That stopped her breath for one beat. Entrusted, not pitied, not acquired. The distinction cut deep because it sounded like duty. And duty from powerful men had failed her before. Rain thickened as they crossed the Strand. He reached to the leather strap above the door, rapped twice and spoke through the hatch without raising his voice. "Faster to Wickliffe House. Use the river road. Avoid market choke points," the coachman called assent. The hatch closed. Silence returned, not empty but taut. Eleanor shifted the blanket tighter and felt the ache in her shoulders protest. The movement exposed her left wrist. His eyes dropped there at once. "Hold still," he said. She didn't move. He leaned forward across the narrow space, took her forearm with careful pressure, and turned it toward the weak light. The bruises that had lived half hidden under wet cuff and mud now lay plain. Old yellowing ovals, newer violet marks, finger-shaped shadows that could not be explained by clumsiness. He released her and sat back. "You were not struck once," he said. "No. You were underfed for months." She gave a tired, brittle sound that was not laughter. "Years. Your shoes leak at both seams. Your hem was mended 3 times with sail thread, not dress thread. Your left sleeve was reattached by candlelight. The stitches are accurate but uneven at the underarm where your hand cramped." Heat rose in her face, not from comfort. "Did your grace summon me to inventory my poverty? I'm naming what others allowed themselves not to see." The words landed harder than anger. She looked away first. Her throat hurt in a new place. By the time they passed Somerset House, the rain had eased to a fine, relentless mist that made every lamp haloed and distant. Carriages crowded one junction, then parted when they saw Wickliffe livery. Rank opened roads. She had known this in theory. Watching it from inside changed the knowledge into bitterness. "You were in the gallery," she said suddenly. His eyes returned to hers. "Yes." "You watched before you came down." "Yes." "How long?" "Long enough." She waited. He did not elaborate. Command in him ran bone deep. Explanation seemed to cost him more than orders. Yet she had asked, and he had answered, and each answer carried a weight she did not know where to place. "I thought you would protect the portrait first," he said after a moment. "Most would." "I did protect it." "You set it down and ran toward a stable boy you did not know while the woman who controlled your life stood 10 paces away with witnesses. He could not breathe. You could have lost your only proof." "I know." His hand closed around the head of his cane. Not tight. Deliberate. "I saw that." Eleanor felt a strange unsteadiness move through her, as if floorboards she had trusted had shifted half an inch. People had watched her all her life. They watched to judge, to rank, to use. This was different and no safer for being so. The carriage hit a rut hard enough to throw her sideways. Pain flashed through her bandaged palm when she caught the seat edge. He moved instantly, crossing the space in one motion. One arm braced against the wall behind her shoulders before she struck it. The carriage rocked again. He remained where he was, close enough that she could smell rain on wool and clean starch, and a faint trace of smoke from the hall. "Steady," he said. "I am steady." "Liar." The word was quiet, almost without emphasis. "Your teeth are striking together." She had not noticed until he said it. Humiliation pricked. She forced her jaw still. He stayed there through the next stretch of broken road, body angled to shield her from each jolt, hand planted against the panel above her shoulder, unmoving as the carriage swayed and pitched. He could have returned to his seat. He did not. When the wheels finally found smooth paving again, he withdrew at once and sat opposite as before, but the space between them had altered in a way she could not undo. The hatch opened from outside without warning. A footman rode up alongside, rein at his lashes. "Your Grace, message from the house. Dr. Fenwick is in attendance for Lord Matthew's leg. He can remain." The Duke answered without looking away from Eleanor. "He remains. Prepare hot broth, bread, and the blue sitting-room fire. Send Mrs. Harrow to the front stair." His gaze flicked once to Eleanor's bound hands. "And warm water. No perfumes." The footman nodded and fell back. Eleanor frowned. "I do not require a physician." "You require examination." "I require food and quiet." "You shall have both. You shall also have a physician." "I have no coin to pay him." His jaw set. "You will not discuss coin with me tonight." "Tonight becomes habit quickly in houses like mine." "This is not your house." The sentence struck sharper than he seemed to intend. He saw it land. A beat passed. "Not yet," he said. She did not answer. She did not know what he meant, and fear had taught her never to accept sentences whose terms were hidden. Wickliffe House rose from the rain like a ship of stone, broad-fronted and dark-windowed, except for 2 lit floors and the glow at the entrance where lamps burned behind glass. Iron gates stood open. The carriage rolled through without slowing. Gravel hissed under wheels. By the second bell afternoon, the sky had lightened to pewter, but the cold had deepened. When the carriage stopped, he stepped down first and turned back immediately, hand out, waiting. She hated that she needed it. She took it anyway. His grip was firm and dry despite the weather. The front doors opened before they reached them. Warmth met her in a wave that smelled of beeswax, coal fire, and old wood. A housekeeper in dark bombazine stood just inside, grey hair smoothed under cap, eyes sharp and unreadable in the practised servant way. "Mrs. Harrow," the Duke said, "this is Miss Eleanor Ross. She is to be given the blue sitting-room, food at once, and any assistance she requests. No one questions her. No one delays her. Send for Miss Lane from the maid's hall to help with dry clothing if Miss Ross permits." Mrs. Harrow bowed her head to Eleanor, not deeply, but with unmistakable respect. "Miss Ross," Eleanor managed. "Thank you." The Duke turned to a waiting footman. "Mr. Hale, sealed items from the carriage go directly to my study safe. You and Whittaker witness placement. Then bring the inventory book to me." "Yes, Your Grace." Physical proof, accounted for again, not lost in transit. Eleanor felt some knot in her chest ease by one careful thread. She took 2 steps into the hall, and the world tilted. Heat and hunger rose together, dark at the edges. She caught herself on a console table, breath gone shallow. Mrs. Harrow moved at once, but the Duke was closer. His hand closed around Eleanor's elbow, holding her upright without spectacle. "Sit," he said. "I can stand." "Sit," command again, care disguised as authority because that language was the only one he spoke fluently. She let him guide her to a carved chair near the entrance fire. Her knees gave the moment she bent. He did not comment. A tray arrived almost immediately, as if the household had rehearsed obedience for years. Broth steaming in a china cup, thick slices of bread, a small plate of cold beef. Eleanor stared at it and felt both gratitude and panic. Food this rich after fasting could turn traitor. He seemed to read the calculation in her face. "Slowly," he said. "Broth first, bread second." "You issue orders for swallowing now." "I issue orders you remain conscious." Mrs. Harrow dismissed 2 footmen with a glance and stood back, guarding distance like a wall with pulse. Eleanor lifted the cup. Her bandaged fingers trembled against the porcelain. The Duke reached and steadied the saucer underneath without touching her hand. She drank. Heat hit her empty stomach and almost hurt. She drank again. 3 measured swallows in. The shaking eased. Doctor. Fenwick entered from the inner corridor carrying a leather case and professional caution. He was middle-aged, mild-faced, and plainly curious. He began with the Duke. "My lord, Lord Matthew's splint has been reset. If this is urgent, I can—" "It is urgent," the Duke said. "Miss Ross first." The physician turned toward Eleanor and softened his tone. "Miss, with your permission." She looked at the Duke. "Will he report to Mrs. Ross?" "No, to the magistrate, if relevant." She considered, then nodded once. "Very well." Examination was brisk and decent. Pulse, pupils, hands unwrapped and cleaned, splits salved and rebound, bruises noted in a small notebook with date and visible pattern. Dr. Fenwick asked few questions and did not offer the false pity she despised. "No fracture," he said at last. "Exhaustion, cold stress, nutritional depletion, and repeated contusions. She must rest, regular meals, warmth, no strain on the hands for 48 hours. "She will have it," the Duke said. Dr. Fenwick capped his ink. "I should provide a written memorandum for legal use given the marks." "Do so. Today? Now." The physician bowed and withdrew to the writing desk in the corner. External contact, outcome immediate. Even in this house, evidence moved by process, not sentiment. Eleanor finished half the broth and 1 slice of bread. Her body, distrustful, accepted both. Fatigue rose heavier after food, pulling at her eyelids. She fought it because sleeping in unknown rooms had consequences in her experience. Theft, locked doors, orders shouted over waking. The Duke had moved to the hearth and stood with one hand on the mantel, watching the fire as if it had asked him a question he disliked. He had removed his greatcoat. Without it he looked even more severe, black coat cut close, shoulders broad enough to block light from the nearest lamp. He did not pace. He did not speak. He remained still in a way that felt less like rest than restraint. "Mrs." Harrow came to Eleanor's side with a folded wool gown and dry stockings. "Miss Lane is waiting in the next room, if you wish assistance." Eleanor nodded, then hesitated. "My letter, the one with the seal." The Duke answered without turning. "In my study, safe. Logged under witness. You will see it again before dusk." She believed him. The belief frightened her more than doubt. Dr. Fenwick returned with a folded sheet. "Memorandum complete, Your Grace." The Duke took it, scanned, and handed it to Mr. Hale, who had appeared soundlessly at the door. "Duplicate to magistrate's clerk by special messenger. Receipt required." "Yes, Your Grace." Another thread tied down. Nothing left loose for convenient disappearance. Eleanor rose slowly. The room swayed, then settled. She gathered the blanket around her shoulders and made herself speak with formal clarity. "Your Grace has acted with fairness today. I acknowledge it." His head turned then. Firelight cut across his face, catching the scar at his thumb, and the strain he kept banked so hard it nearly vanished. "Fairness is a low word for what is owed." She met his gaze. It is the only word I trust yet." Something shifted in his expression, too slight for most to mark. Not softness, not surrender. A crack in stone, narrow and real. "Then trust this," he said. "You will sleep in a room with a key on your side of the door. You will eat before any legal discussion resumes. And until the court hears every line, you do not walk any corridor in this house alone." She should have argued the last point. She did not have strength left for pride without purpose. "As your Grace commands." His mouth moved once, almost that same near smile from the yard, and was gone. "For once," he said quietly. "Yes." Mrs. Harrow stepped forward to guide Eleanor toward the blue sitting room and the adjoining chamber, prepared in haste and discipline. At the threshold, Eleanor looked back once. The Duke had not resumed his former position by the fire. He stood exactly where she had left him, memorandum in one hand, the other braced on the mantel, as motionless as if movement itself would be a betrayal of something he had only just admitted by action, and could not yet name aloud. Mrs. Harrow led Eleanor through a short passage hung with dark landscapes, and into a chamber where blue silk on the walls softened the winter light to dusk. Miss Lane helped her from the wet dress with quiet efficiency, said nothing about the bruises, and laced her into a plain wool gown borrowed from the housekeeper's stores. When Eleanor's hair had been dried and braided, Mrs. Harrow returned with a tray of broth, oat bread, and stewed apple, and with it a folded note in Mr. Hale's careful hand. Receipt obtained from magistrate's clerk. Hearing ordered at 4 o'clock in the auction hall. All detained parties to be produced. Eleanor read it twice, feeling the hour close around her like iron bands. There would be no private settlement, no corridor bargain, no quiet disappearance. She ate because she would need strength to stand in public and be called liar once more before the truth could be named law. By 3:30, rain had thinned to a hard mist, and lamps were being lit along the lane when the Wickliffe carriage returned to the same colonnade. This time Eleanor descended with dry stockings, a mended glove over each bandage, and Mrs. Harrow's dark mantle clasped at her throat. Inside the hall the benches had been rearranged into a magistrate's court. The same clerk who had written courier now sat beneath an oath card, and did not meet her eye until she faced him directly. He rose then, swallowed, and said, "Miss Ross, I have brought every ledger page under Ross consignments from the last 3 years, as ordered." His voice shook only once. "The entry signatures appear in 2 hands." It was not apology. It was testimony. The Duke stood at her right, not touching her. His presence, a wall no one pretended not to see. On a central table lay every physical proof sealed and labelled. The portrait in linen and twine, the torn lock plate with stag crest, Captain Ross's folded letter in a glass sleeve, Dr. Fenwick's memorandum with the clerk's stamped receipt, and a canvas packet Mrs. Harrow had sent from Hertford an hour earlier by mounted messenger under guard. Eleanor untied that final packet with careful fingers. Out came her hidden copies of freight accounts, edges smoke-stained from years behind the stair-post, and 3 half-burned correspondence fragments rescued from kitchen ash, each bearing remnants of dates and amounts. One showed Lambert note satisfied in Captain Ross's hand before the line was charred away. Another held the beginning of a remittance instruction addressed to Wickliffe trustees. The magistrate leaned forward over his spectacles and asked for silence. Ross entered between 2 constables, silk exchanged for plain grey wool, rose scent gone beneath the sour air of holding cells. Clara and Juliana followed, pale and rigid, their outrage now brittle with fear. When they saw the table of evidence, Clara's composure cracked first. "Those are household papers," she said. "She stole them." Eleanor answered before the magistrate could rebuke either of them. "I copied the freight accounts from memory when the originals disappeared. The burned fragments were taken from our kitchen grate after Mrs. Ross fed correspondence to fire. The remittances were never theft from her. They were theft by her." Mrs. Ross lifted her chin. "A dependent makes fantasies when cornered." The magistrate held up one finger. "You will speak in turn, Mrs. Ross." He nodded to the parish beadle waiting near the door. "Call Reverend Pike." Reverend Pike, stooped and damp from travel, presented the Hertford Register and a sworn addendum written that morning. The burial notice for Eleanor Ross at age 2 had been entered on a loose slip, never bound into the official parish book, and signed by a curate dead these 11 years. The ink differed, the hand differed, The church seal had been pressed backward. "Forgery," the Reverend said, voice steady with clerical fury. "Inserted to simulate record. Not authentic." A low murmur moved through the hall, then died when the magistrate struck the desk. The next witness was the yard groom whose boy had collapsed. He testified to Mrs. Ross striking Eleanor with her glove before consignments opened. The clerk confirmed it, eyes fixed on the wood grain, as if shame were easier to bear while looking down. The lady in plum silk who had watched that morning did not appear. Her absence was entered into the record by name, and no one in authority pretended not to notice. Mr. Ellis, the auction surgeon, read Doctor. Fenwick's memorandum aloud and added his own observation, contusions in stages of healing consistent with repeated grasping force, not a single mishap. Clara wept at this, not from remorse but from the new terror of association. Juliana stared at Eleanor with the same old contempt and said nothing at all. Whatever loaded looks either sister had carried for years yielded no secret beyond cowardice. Their silence was noted, and the record moved on without them. At last the magistrate asked, "Miss Ross, what remedy do you seek?" Eleanor had imagined this question in attic dark for years, and had filled it with revenge in 100 private forms. Standing beneath public light with the portrait beside her and the Duke at her shoulder, she found the answer cleaner than rage. "Lawful restoration," she said, "not private vengeance. Return of my father's estate shares held in trust. Accounting of all intercepted remittances. Recognition of my legal name and standing. Penalty for fraud, assault and guardianship theft as statute requires." The magistrate turned to the Duke. "Your Grace, as named guardian in the letter and trustee of the remittance fund, what say you?" Adrian Vale stepped forward one pace. He removed his gloves and set them on the table, as if laying down a weapon. "Good," he said, each word carrying to the far wall. "I restore Miss Ross in full before this court." He placed a second packet beside the magistrate's blotter. 20 years of trust disbursement orders from Wickliffe accounts, every quarter signed and sealed, every payment marked received by proxies, now traced to Mrs. Ross's household steward. The chain was complete. Physical evidence submitted, analysed, connected. No thread remained in rumour. The magistrate wrote for several minutes while the room listened to the scratch of his pen. When he finished, he read judgment in a dry, formal voice that altered lives by clauses. Fraud proved, assault proved, forgery proved, guardianship theft proved, Mrs. Ross to debtor's prison pending full restitution schedule and seizure of unlawfully held assets. Clara and Juliana released under bond with no claim on Ross property absent further petition. Immediate restoration of Miss Eleanor Ross's legal identity, inheritance rights, and household authority. The constables moved in. Mrs. Ross turned once toward Eleanor as irons were set, eyes bright with hatred stripped of polish. "You will fail without me," she said. Eleanor held her gaze and answered in the tone she had denied herself for 20 years. "I already succeeded without you." The constables led Mrs. Ross out through the same side door where she had entered in silk that morning. Witnesses shifted to make room, and for once the room parted for the right woman. By the time they returned to Wickliffe House, night had settled blue-black against the windows, and the cold had sharpened. Mrs. Harrow brought a supper tray to the Duke's study rather than the dining room at his order. Eleanor stood on the threshold and stopped. Above the mantel, lit by fire and 2 candles, hung the restored portrait of the little girl with the wooden horse. Beneath it lay Captain Ross's letter, the lock plate, and the court order in a neat row on the desk, each in fresh protective sleeves, labelled in Mr. Hale's hand, and cross-entered in the inventory ledger. The sea chest marked CR had also arrived from the auction hold under seal. Whitaker opened it in their presence to reveal only uniforms, charts, and one child's primer with Eleanor's name on the flyleaf. Nothing was withheld. Nothing was substituted. Even the strange details had answers now. Eleanor read the court order once, then again, and signed the receipt of restoration with a hand that steadied as the ink dried. Mrs. Harrow watched from the sideboard with knowing eyes and no intrusion. Mr. Hale bowed and withdrew. The door closed. Fire crackled. Fatigue came down over Eleanor like a heavy cloak. She sat on the hearth rug, because the warmth reached bone there, one shoulder against the wing chair. She intended to rest for a minute only. Sleep took her before she could resist it. When she woke, the fire had burned lower and the room was deep with midnight quiet. Her neck ached from the angle. A folded wool throw covered her to the waist. Adrian Vale still sat in the chair above her, one hand on the armrest, the other near the court order, exactly where she had last seen him, except for the candles melted to half height. He had not gone to dinner. He had not rung for brandy. He had not moved away while she slept at his feet beneath her own portrait. Duration this time was proof. He saw her eyes open and said only, "Eat." A fresh tray waited on the side table, kept warm under a silver dome. She ate in silence while he remained still, and the stillness was stranger than speech. Near dawn, when the house was not yet stirring, they walked to the small chapel off the east corridor because she said she needed air, and he said nothing, only took a lamp. At the threshold she stopped where stone met worn carpet. Candlelight touched the planes of his face and left his eyes dark. "Why keep my face for 20 years?" she asked. He didn't answer at once. One breath, then another. "Because I failed you once," he said. The words entered her like cold water and left warmth behind. She looked past him at the altar rail, then back at the man who had spoken no tenderness and offered no performance, only process, protection, and that single admission. "If I accept what comes next," she said, "it is on terms." "Name them." "Legal autonomy in writing, stewardship of Ross House in my hand. My ledgers remain mine. No confinement disguised as care. No decisions about my name, my money, or my work made without my signature." He held her gaze. "Agreed." "Then speak plainly." He set the lamp on the stone ledge between them, as if setting down rank with it. "Eleanor Ross, will you marry me?" She felt the old fear lift, not vanish, but change shape into something she could carry without bending. "Yes," she said, "with those terms witnessed." "They will be witnessed." At noon the contracts were drafted by both solicitors, read aloud in the study under the portrait, amended once at her request, and signed by both hands with Mrs. Harrow and Mr. Hale as witnesses. At evening prayer they stood in the chapel before a small gathered household and the same magistrate who had restored her name, and vows were spoken without ornament and without coercion. When it was done, Adrian offered his arm, Eleanor took it by choice, and they crossed the threshold together into a house that had ceased to be a place of hiding and become, at last, a place where the record matched the truth.